Hello everybody, Michael Kummer here with Exciting. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar about best practice on SAP role redesign. With me today I have Jeff Porter, one of our senior security consultants, who is going to walk you through today's webinar. Just before we start, a few housekeeping questions. You'll see, or you should see, a questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you have any questions on anything you see or hear, please feel free to submit your question using that control panel. We'll try to reply to those questions throughout the webinar in writing. And then at the end of the webinar, we have approximately 10 to 15 minutes or so to read out some of those questions. Depending on how much time we have, we'll try to get to as many as possible so everyone can benefit from the questions and answers. So we'll read them out loud and also answer them, but definitely we'll try to reply already in writing up front as much as we can. Today's webinar is going to be recorded, so you'll receive a link with the recording, I think within 24 hours. If you don't and you'd like to get a link, let me know. Jeff will show my contact information towards the end, or you can just reply to the webinar announcement email that you've received a few days ago. That'll work too. And with that being said, actually one more thing, maybe this is webinar number 1 of a 2-series webinar. So today we're going to talk about more generally about best practices when it comes to designing and redesigning roles in SAP. And in the next webinar, Jeff going to share the details with you. We're going to execute on that by showing you some of the tools you can use to expedite those steps. And with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We'll just go ahead and get started. A little bit about Exciting. We were founded in 2008 by SAP security experts. We are headquartered in Switzerland. We are at about 60 employees worldwide now. We have offices in Germany, Switzerland, England, Romania, and most recently here in the US. And all of the senior consultants are also SAP trainers. So we all of us end up doing SAP training at some point or another. Today's agenda, we're going to go through just some basic fundamentals of SAP authorization management, particularly SU24. Then we're going to talk about the best practice approach for authorization redesign projects. We're going to talk about optimization of custom developments, so your custom code, custom transactions. Go through some things that you need to consider for those. Testing, we're going to talk about testing your redesign roles and some areas that you need to pay attention to in that. And then we'll do a wrap up at the end where we'll take some questions, anything that Michael or Alessandra didn't get a chance to answer online, and I'll talk about the next webinar in this series. So the first part of this role redesign project that we need to talk about and consider is the transaction SU24. This is essentially the building blocks for good role design. SU24 is a transaction from SAP that allows you to link authorization objects and default values to certain transactions or other objects, things like function modules, webbed-in pros, those kind of things. For our conversation, we're going to focus on transactions. Just be aware that you can link it to other types of objects as well. What the authorizations do, or what you do in SU24, is you link via a transaction, you will link authorizations to default values. We can also use check indicators on these authorizations to change the way a transaction or an authority check happens for that object. So we can turn transaction authority checks on and we can turn them off. We can turn authority checks on for objects and authorizations inside the system. So using these default values, we can impact the way a transaction or a function module executes in the way of security. For our discussion, like I said, we're going to focus on a transaction. Within the SU24 transaction, we're going to go in and we're going to link certain authorization objects and a check indicator with some proposed values. What this allows us to do is when we go into a role profile generator and we insert a transaction into the menu, What will happen is when you save that transaction to the menu, into the role, SU24, SAP will go out to SU24 and it will bring the default values into the authorization tab for us automatically. What this allows you to do is to not play the guessing game of what objects are required to authorize a person for a certain transaction. SAP delivers a good bunch of this for us through the SU25 transaction, which we do during an upgrade. But we go through the system and we end up having to make changes to that based on our own configuration, particularly around the areas of custom authorizations, custom T codes, custom programs, those kind of things. All right, so if the check indicator is equal to check, which means we want the system to check this authorization when it comes to it in this transaction or program, and the proposal value is set to yes, then those proposed values that we set in SU24 will automatically be brought into the role when we add that transaction to the role. All right, if the check indicator is set to no check, we can turn that authorization check off. The authorization check won't happen against the authorization object for that transaction or that program. Or if you set the proposal status to no, the authorization check will still happen. We just won't bring this into the role with us. So when you add that transaction, we won't add that to the role. All right, so this is really core to understanding how the profile generator works and ensuring that the profile generator works correctly. Using this, you maintain objects in the menu. When you add things to the menu, the required objects will be brought into the role automatically with the default values. Likewise, when you take things out of the role, right? So if we remove a transaction from the role, things will be, the authorization objects behind the scenes will be pulled out of that role. Okay, that's kind of the purpose. It gives you the functionality to add and remove the objects behind the scenes. So you don't have to try and remember what's required for every authorization. Okay. All right, so this is also very important. The SU24 stuff is going to be very important if you end up doing a migration to the S4HANA system. The better and the harder, the more optimized your SU24 values are for your company, the better and smoother your migration will go when you come to S4HANA. There's a lot of new objects that are being added. There's a lot of new T codes that are being added in S4HANA. And there are some migration tools available that basically use the SU24 values to update your roles for you. And in the next webinar, we'll show you our version of that tool and how we can help migrate your current system to an S4HANA system. So some of the other things that you have to think about is the objectives of an authorization concept. So before you even get started with your redesign, you have to understand that an authorization concept, your authorization concept, needs to reduce the risk based on your changes. So as you make changes to the roles now and in the future, one of the concept deliverables needs to be minimizing the risk, right? So when you make a change, you need to be able to minimize the risk going into production. Transparency, all right? So another big goal for your security concept is to be transparent with what you're authorizing users to do. This isn't anything new, but it's awfully difficult to understand and get into an authorization concept. And we're going to talk about why that is when we start talking about role design concepts. Also needs to be consistent and stable, right? So you don't want a lot of open authorizations in your roles when you move them to production, right? So you need them to be consistent, right? So you need them all be built the same way under the same kind of design concept. You don't want different kinds of, you don't want composite roles and derived roles and enabler roles mixed in, because then your concept becomes very muddled and hard to maintain. And that would be the last thing, maintainability. Most designs are great when they first get implemented because it's exactly what you want. Over the course of 3 to 4 months or even a year or two, the maintainability can be very different picture at that point. So it also needs to be scalable, right? So as you add and remove companies, or as you get SOX compliant issues or regulatory issues, your concept, your security concept, needs to be able to grow and contract with those requirements. All right, so now we'll start talking about the actual best practice. So we've talked about kind of the fundamentals of what you need to think about a role design. Let's talk about the best practice for authorization redesign projects. First thing is the reasoning. Why are you doing this? Why are you in the process of redesigning your security? That's not a small undertaking, and most people, in my experience, most companies lose track in the middle of a project of the why they're redesigning. What goal are they trying to fix? Right? You could be in the middle of an upgrade, right? You could have standardized, you want to standardize your role concept. Maybe your role concept has migrated or you've inherited another company's security, right? And it doesn't match your kind of security, the model that you've put together. You may have a fragmented role structure, right? It may have grown, it may be very fragmented, so it may not be maintainable at this point, and you just need to fix it. You could have compliance and legal requirements, right? So when Enron and WorldCom came around and they introduced everybody to the world of SOX compliance, right? We had that. You now have change in authorization in your org structure, right? So you're buying and selling companies, merging companies. Those things happen all the time as well, and you need to be able to adjust for that. Your compliance for separation of functions, so that's your standard SOD, your SOC stuff, or you may be implementing GRC. Some of the other factors that may influence this, you may have gone through an audit, right? And so now you need to do some audit remediation, which requires a certain part of your security be redesigned. One of the big changes that we're seeing now in our conversations with clients and at the different shows and ASUG meetings we go to is that SAP has changed their licensing model this year. So in the past, users were classified based on what they did in the system, right? So they come in, you do your SLAW review, you would get ST03N data. They would check what the user was actually doing in the system and base your license review on that. That's no longer the case. SAP now comes in and they're going to look at what the user is authorized to do, right? They're no longer caring what the user's actually been doing. They want to look at what the user is authorized to do. So now your role design is very key in that license model. If you have users that are over authorized, right, which is typically the case, is particularly your power users are typically way over authorized. Those license requirements that they used to fall into may not be the same license payment that you're going to have to make in the future based on the new license model. So keep that in mind when you go through your redesign. Some of the influencing factors. So when you're designing your roles, now you need to start thinking about the role design themselves. Are these create roles? Are these roles that allow create and change, or is it supposed to be a display only type role? We need to know the difference of responsibilities. Are we doing modules, or are we going to do process view? How are we going to build the security inside the role for the different responsibilities? We need to know where we're building the role for. Is this going to be a dev and a QA system role, or is it going to be a production role? Certain users have way different access depending on what system they're in. Your developers, for instance, have huge access in development, but they have very limited access in production. Same with basis and you yourself, security folks. Security people have much different access in production than we typically have in a development or QA system. So we have to keep that in mind. The org structure. Has our company gone through a different org structure? Is our current setup not working correctly for us? Is the maintenance just becoming too much when it comes to the org structure? So we need to keep that in mind. The different types of data types. All right, so master data, transaction data versus customizing, you need to think about that. And then the classification. So now it's all the add-in stuff that you also need to start considering. So you have your different laws and regulations, your SOX, your GDPR. That's another new one that a lot of people are struggling with is the GDPR. You know, in your company guidelines, depending on what industry you're in, you may have certain government or company guidelines around that as well. Keep in mind, GDPR is very new and we're not getting a lot of information from SAP at this point as to what constitutes GDPR access in SAP. Right, so we've talked quite a bit with some of our folks in Europe where this is first initially hit, and we're finding that The best that we can do at the moment is that we can define what objects, what authorization objects, allow you to access GDPR data. We don't know if you're accessing GDPR data with these objects, but they'll give you the ability to access that data. You'll see in our next webinar as well, where we have a tool that will help you look at that access as well and identify roles that have access or potential access to GDPR data. All right, and then comes the big discussion. If you're a security administrator, we could probably sit down and talk about this alone for hours. So I'm going to kind of just give you an overview of it, what we've seen in the past, what SAP prescribes as best practice. But if you talk to 15 different security administrators, you will get 15 different ways to create roles. There's no hard and fast set way. Everything is different per company. On the right, what you'll see is a chart that basically talks about the different criteria for evaluating a role design. Things like effort of initial role definition, individual role assignments, organizational role maintenance, that kind of stuff. The green, yellow, and red lights basically refer to how supportive is that concept? Does that concept support this criteria and at what level? So for this first one, initial role definition, the enabler roles, which we'll talk about here in a minute, have a very high degree of support. The single roles and the derived roles, again, have a high degree of support, where composite roles aren't bad, but they're not great either, right? So that's kind of how that chart works. Down here, I have a blog written by Alessandro Banzer, our CEO, where he goes into great detail about this chart and the pros and cons to the different types of role concepts we're going to talk about right now. I highly recommend reading that if you're struggling with what concept should you decide on. Single roles, which are by definition the SAP best practice roles. SAP says this is the way you should build roles, and this includes your derived roles, since derived roles are essentially single roles with built-in inheritance from a master role. They offer the greatest flexibility and transparency, right? So a single role has the most obvious transparency of all the role designs, because you can look at a role and see exactly what's included in it when it's assigned to a user. Your composite roles, on the other hand, are basically a collection of single roles, and they have the benefit of looking great on paper, right? So composite roles are basically a collection of single roles that are grouped into a single composite role. This comes with some inherent problems. On the surface, it seems like a wonderful thing in that you could build ID business roles for them. But where they start to lose their luster is when it comes time for maintenance and user administration. Initially, the composite roles are great. They're purpose built, but when things need to change, they're not very flexible. Where do you add transactions? Because a single role that is grouped into a composite role can be used in many composite roles. So adding a transaction to one role impacts all of the composite roles that single role is added to. So you may not, and you may inadvertently give access to users that you didn't intend to when you add things. Same thing with removing roles and removing access. If you remove an access from a single role that's in a composite, you remove that access from everybody who has that single role, no matter what composite it's attached to. So very quickly, your maintenance of a composite role becomes very convoluted and very complex. The user administration side of that becomes very complex as well. So this is one of those areas where it starts out great and it looks great on paper, but in practice, after a while, it leads to a lot of problems. And this is typically where you see the most role redesign concepts come from, or initiatives come from, is from a composite role standpoint that has gone off the tracks. One of the other issues that composite roles now face is the SAP licensing issue we talked about. Many of these composite roles over-authorize the users they're assigned to, because they only need a fraction of the access that's in a composite role. All of the other surplus access is given to them in over-authorizations, and that has a good chance of impacting the new license model. So if you're currently sitting on a composite role situation, you need to consider the impact, again, of the SAP license model, because it could very drastically change your current situation. Last but not least, and the most unsustainable of all of the roles concepts out there, is the enabler role concept. It's essentially where you split the organizational values, the organizational fields, out of the functional authorizations. So you have two separate roles at minimum. One of them contains the organizational fields, the organizational authorizations, and the other contains all of the functional authorizations. So at the end of the day, users need at least two of these roles to be productive. The issue with this is that the organizational fields also contain activities. So if you want to give somebody display access to a company code, and then you have to have a change access and a create access at the same time. So that's three different roles you now have to create for just authorizing those three different levels of activity. All right, so very fast, this gets very complex, very convoluted very quickly. Again, this type of concept looks wonderful on paper. When you go to management and you say, hey, we've got this great concept we want to implement, it looks really good on paper because it looks like administration is super easy. But again, much like composite roles, very quickly it goes off tracks and gets unmanageable very quickly. Some of the other issues around enabler roles, and I'm going to beat up on them a little bit, is you can't use them with the new visual type applications that SAP is coming out with, particularly Fiori. I think we're also going to see this issue when we start really diving into the cloud. I don't think enabler type access is going to work there either. Transparency with enabler roles is extremely hard to do as well, because you're looking at more than one role. So if you're having to do audit, or you're having to do critical authorization type compliance screening, you have a very convoluted matrix of roles that you now have to test for. So that becomes very difficult as well. Okay, so the analysis we talked about becomes much harder for enabler roles. From a standpoint, the single roles are the SAP best practice. Stick with single roles as much as you can. In a perfect world, you're going to get a single role that covers everything a user needs for one job in one role. That's the perfect world. That would be the nirvana, if you will. Typically, that can't happen, right? Because most companies won't allow for inherent SODs inside of a role. So you could break that role out into 2 or 3 different roles, and you'll have your general display type access as well. At the most, you want to have a user that has 3 to 4 roles maximum to their ID. That gives you the greatest bit of flexibility and control when it comes to SOD and conflicts and your transparency. Again, for more information, a lot more detailed information about these concepts, go to this blog. Alessandra's done a wonderful job about explaining all of the different pros and cons for each of the different types of role design concepts. All right, so when you're building your roles and you've decided on your role concept, there's some other things that you need to keep in mind while you're going through this exercise. The first and foremost, we talked about it before, is the driving reason for the implementation. What problem are you trying to fix, or what problems are you trying to fix? Most folks, when they get to a role redesign, they already have a good idea of what they want their new roles to look like. And it's just a matter of, how do I go about doing it? How do I go about getting the design that I want? So you need to do the consideration of organization access, your regulatory changes we talked about. The biggest one being the ease of maintenance and your audit remediation later on, right? What are we trying to fix to get for this role design? At the end of the day, that's what we have to produce at the end of the day, is the fix for whatever it is that's driving this. You need to ensure that your role definitions match what people are actually doing. So a typical role redesign is you go to the company, you go to the business, and you sit down with them and you bring out the STO3N data spreadsheets or wherever you're getting your historical data from. And you sit down with them and you try and ask them, what do your roles need to look like? Tell us what you want them to look like. And they really don't know. For the most part, the business doesn't know and they don't care. They just want to do their job. So what you need to do is you need to focus on how are you going to construct these roles for them? How are you going to suggest to them, these are what your roles we think need to look at. To do that, use the STO3N data that you have. Group users together. Avoid giving them too much access, right? So don't let them tell you that, hey, you know, I think we're going to want this transaction and I think we want that one now. And when you look at ST03N or you look at your, they've never used it before, right? You want to avoid that over authorization and giving them more access than they wanted. If you have the correct data and you have the correct tools, you can see how often a user is running this data, right? So maybe you've got a whole handful of transactions that one user ran one time in the history. Maybe they don't need that access anymore. Maybe you can take that away. So those are all things you need to look at. It's been our experience that job roles make the best roles, the best single roles. Focus your role build on jobs for users. You can get a list of jobs in PPOME. If you go to transaction PPOME and you're maintaining your org structure, you should have a list of jobs there. It's a perfect example of where to go to start figuring out these are the kind of job roles that I need to build. It's not uncommon to create generic access. We talked about that. You know, your default, your all user role. Those are perfectly fine. Where you give them, you know, printing, SAP Office Mail, or you have your display only roles. Those are very common and not, I wouldn't suggest changing that concept. You know, you don't need to put that kind of access into every role. If you can come up with a generic access role that all users can get, certainly do that. Just make sure that it's audit compliant, you know, no SODs, those kind of things. All right. Other considerations you need to think about when you're doing this role concept design is the ease of the role maintenance, right? You need to think about not what you're doing today, right? What's it going to look like when I'm done here is how easy is this going to be if we have to do an upgrade later? How easy is my change going to be if we have to get rid of a company, if I have to divest a company, or if I have to get another company brought into the system, how easy can I adopt their security to my new concept? Those are the kind of situations you need to talk about, and you need to have those conversations before you actually start building roles inside of the system. Okay. Again, the SAP license, what is the cost of this role going to be? All right. Again, in the future, you're going to have to assume or know what the role is going to cost when you assign it to a user. Is that going to put them in a new license class, right? A contractual license class, because you only have so many licenses that your company has purchased. And one of the big places you get hit with fees is when you go over your license count, right? So you have to know up front nowadays what this role is going to cost when you give it to a user. Okay, and then of course your SOD issues, right? You have to do that scanning of the SOD issues up front. Again, we have tools. We're going to show in the next webinar. We'll show you tools that we provide with the XAMS software that make all of this much easier, a whole lot easier than it is today in a standard SAP world. All right, so once we've got our concept and we're in the process of building our roles, there is the inevitable discussion that you're going to have about your custom ABAP programs and your custom Java programs and your custom transactions. Typically, they're greatly overlooked just because it's a very complex thing to get involved with. You need to ensure that the custom code and the custom transactions are properly secured. For your simple reporting transactions, the one that just bring up data, you don't necessarily have to have authority checks in there unless they're reporting on critical data like HR data, that kind of stuff. But a simple report that's just bringing up some general information that nobody really cares if it's secured or not, you can get away with tossing a TSTCA check on there. If you're not familiar with TSTCA, that is a check that happens at the transaction level before the program is even run, right? So before the transaction even prevents a screen to you, this TSTCA authorization check happens, and you can find it in SE93 is where it's typically created, but it will also show up in SU24. So that's another value that you need to maintain in SU24 is your TSTCA check. Just note that it's not uncommon for people to go through an audit and get flagged with issues on unsecured programs in production, right, where they don't have the correct security or they don't have authority checks in there. Some of those you can get away with, right? Some of those you can say, okay, yeah, those are just report. We don't care if anybody sees that information. Other reports that actually update data or access critical data, however, a common practice is to go out and throw a TSTCA check on there because it's really quick. You don't have to code anything. It's just a quick thing, but that will not pass the eyes of a good auditor simply because that is at the transaction level. If that report or if that program is in another transaction or called via another transaction, that authority check doesn't take place. So the TSTCA check is not an end-all be-all for securing custom code. You have to do your due diligence on those, and they're painful, and you just have to do them. So keep that in mind when you're doing your redesigns. Analysis of custom code, again, security assets, it's costly, so therefore a lot of times it's bypassed. It's the, oh, we'll do it later. It'll be another project. Again, the exciting tools. We have a scanner, a code scanner that we separate ourselves from most of the other scanners out there, and that will analyze your code for authority checks. We'll even suggest authority checks when they're missing. So our tool, again, we'll talk about that in the next webinar, but we do have tools that will do that for you. Okay. Again, this is another area where auditors come in, and it's usually the second thing they start messing with. First thing they come in and do, and they look at your standard users. Are those locked up like they're supposed to be? The access changed, passwords easily guessed. The next thing they go do is your programs. They go out and they start looking at, unsecured programs. So you can't dodge this. You have to get it done. Whether you do it now or do it later, it has to be looked at. Another area that often gets missed when we're talking about custom code is the SU24 proposals, right? You can't go into you can do function models, but you can't do programs, but you can go in if it's tied to a transaction, and we can now authorize those security checks inside of SU24. So when you give someone that authority check, or when you give somebody that transaction in the role, the correct authorization objects and values, default values, come in with that transaction, and you don't have to play the guessing game. Just from a consulting standpoint, in my own history, for yourselves, what you need to do is make sure you get inserted into the developer efforts. It's a very tough thing to do. They kind of work in their own silo, but you need to get over there and you need to make friends with the developers and get integrated into their development process. That way you can be ahead of the game of the developments. So when things start to get developed for the business, you know about them up front. And you can get into their guidelines and make sure that they in turn get you involved, right? And you can suggest security checks that need to happen. Okay. So there's dependencies between the development process and the security concept, the authority check statements, the SU24 updates, the program and table authorization groups. There again, those change an awful lot. And so you need to be on top of when those change. Again, that directly ties to your SU24. Those are probably the most common SU24 changes you'll run across are with your program and table auth groups. Those change ridiculously fast in most companies. And typically most folks don't go out and update SU24 when that happens. All right, and then in the naming standards, that's maybe not 100% directly tied between development and the security concept, but it would behoove you to get involved in that conversation as well. All right, so the last part is when we start to test, right? We're going to start testing our roles, and we need to have some best practices around testing. This is typically the most expensive, the most time-consuming of all of the processes, and it's oftentimes the weakest link in a role redesign. The main cause of a go live emergency is bad testing or lack of sufficient testing. Typically, you'll want to have a complete testing script, and your test script needs to include positive and negative testing, right? So you need to test for things that users shouldn't be able to do as well as what they can do. It's been our experience, my experience in particular, that most companies, when you get them to do testing, it's a business user who's thinking about, I got to get back to my job. Let me just make sure these transactions all work and I can do what I need to do. They never go back through and do the negative testing. And that's important for your SOX, your SOD, and your audit reviews later. So you'll get into all that compliance, right? So make sure that you have very good testing scripts and that your testing, you've allotted enough time to do the correct testing. As I have stated here, lack of quality testing is the primary reason you have go live emergencies later on. You run into stuff that wasn't fully tested, and now you have an emergency when you've gone live, and everybody's running through emergency processes now to try and get things fixed. That leads directly to a warping of your design concept, right? So you're in a hurry to get something fixed. You don't take the time to analyze what this change means, and so your security concept immediately, right at go live, starts to go off tracks, right? Because you're fixing emergency errors for the business. All right, so do your quality time up front for the testing. Can't stress that enough. One of the parts of testing that you also need to work on is define the process of remediation. How are you going to go about remediating this issue when it comes up in your testing? Are you going to go back to development, make your change, and transport it forward? Does your transport process even allow you to do that? Can you go from development to QA on demand, or is there a window you have to go through? Are there a lot of hoops you have to jump through to get the transport moved, or can you create your own transports? These are all things that take up time in the testing cycle, and time is your critical factor when it comes to testing, right? So testing equals expense. The longer it takes to test, the more expensive it ends up being. So you want to cut that down as much as you can. One of your options there is what we call a Delta role creation. You can create a generic Delta role for another role in your QA system, and as these issues come up, you can just add those authorizations directly to the Delta role. Then later on, when your testing is complete and everything is authorized the way it needs to be, you can go back to development and now integrate those Delta role authorizations into the new role. Okay, so that's one option to help compress the timeline and help you return some of your time and expense back to the company. You need to consider role owner and audit considerations. Is there required sign off on the testing script before you start? Is there required after you're done? Somebody have to sign off on all this testing afterwards. That is a company deliverable. You have to work that into your timeline. You have to keep that in the back of your mind as well. Does audit need to review the roles before you go to production? Do you need to sit down with the auditors now and show them that there's no SOD conflicts, show them that there's been positive and negative testing? All of that eats away at your scheduled time. And the last thing that can crop up depending on your industry is documentation. Particularly in the defense and energy industry companies, you'll have a thing called control catalogs or control inventories, which basically talk about your system and how you're going to secure it. Most of this documentation has to be finalized and signed off before you're allowed to go to production and go live. Those all have to be completed before then, and there's usually lengthy sign-off processes in the whole process where you have to sit down with several folks, maybe several teams, and go through the findings, go through the security requirements. Why this is important is that your control inventories and your control catalog documents also have to be reflected in your testing scripts, right? So if you have controls that say you're not going to allow developer access in production, you have to show that you've tested the production developer role and that they cannot access anything in production, right? So you have to go through and you have to show that you've accounted for your controls in your control documentation as well. So if that's something that your industry or your company requires, you have to work again that into your timeline. Again, time is expense. The less time you have to actually test, the more time you're doing all this accessory type work, the greater your chances of having more emergencies when you go live. All right. So last thing we'll talk about some wrap ups. We'll come back to the Q&A here in a minute. I'm going to talk about our next webinar. So all the things we talked about today, we have a tool in the next webinar that we want to show you and talk about called the Exciting Authorization Management Suite, or XAMS. This tool is built almost entirely around role redesigns. and that's its main purpose, is to help you do role redesigns. You can see about a 70% time saving in the length of time it takes to do a redesign, typically, with the major areas of time saving happening in the role design part and in the testing area. Those two areas, we can save you a huge amount of time and money. For the role design part, we will show you how you can do role design in a virtual environment, whereas you can go in and you can play what if scenarios. You can drag and drop transactions into roles. You can delete roles. You can virtually assign roles to users and see what that impact would be to the user based on their actual usage data. We can also test the roles virtually for SOD conflicts. Before we've gone to the profile generator, I can test and see if my role via transactions, and again, SU24 values, are going to generate any kind of SOD issues. We can use the SOD, we can use the SOD framework we have built into our tool, or we can tie into GRC. If you have a GRC system, we can tie into that and do those same kind of tests in your GRC system with the virtual roles that we're designing. We can also test for your GDPR access. That's another area that's become very big. If you're a global company and you have users from outside the US that are coming into the system, GDPR is going to be forefront in your design criteria, if not now, very, very soon. And then the last thing is we can also help you calculate the license cost and the impact of that license based on what the role is authorized to do. We can do all of that inside of the virtual role designing tool that we have in the exciting authorization management suite. We can help you with your testing. Another area that we're very good at is helping you with testing. The beautiful thing about the way we test and the way that we provide our testing to customers is that your testers are 100% productive. The testers will actually be doing their day-to-day job while they're testing. We're simply doing this in the background, and we'll talk about that at the same time. So we can reduce the testing cycle pretty much by half, if not better, in your timeline, and we can log everything. So we'll show you that as well in the next webinar. We can talk about we can show you how to monitor your role concept so you can stay clean, right? So once you've gone through all this work, you don't want to do it again. We can monitor your concept on an ongoing basis, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly. We can save those results, right? For the checks that we implement, we can save those results and we can compare them over time. So next time your audit rolls around, you can show your auditors, here's our security concept. Here's where we've tested all of the things that we said we were going to control. Here's where we did it. And you can show the auditor a complete history of how you stayed compliant the entire time from life cycle to life cycle of the audits. We'll show you how that works as well in the next webinar. And so then we also have some functions outside of the redesign where we talk about RFC optimizations. SAP actually recommends our tool for RFC redesigns and optimizations. There's an OSS note here where you can go out and see that SAP actually recommends using our tool for that type of a project as well. Here we have a bunch of useful links that I think will be helpful for you. Just our standard XAMS offerings here if you want to go get some more information on what XAMS actually is. We offer a security blog. We have some very talented, super senior security consultants on our staff who write amazing blogs about security. One of the best blogs I've seen yet is this one by Julius on SU24. It's a whole series of blogs about SU24. If you ever needed more information on how SU24 works or what you can and can't do with it, this blog is exactly what you need to read. This is an amazing series. I would highly suggest reading it. And then every month we have a security challenge where we send out a questionnaire of like 10 questions and you fill it out and you get to learn cool stuff about security. And you can even win prizes. I think every month they have a prize. At this point, I think the current prize, I think we're giving away next week based off of the security tickets to TechEd. So if you want to go to TechEd, fill out the security challenge. I think Michael can talk about it a little bit later, but I think we're giving away tickets to TechEd next week based off of the security challenge. So if nothing else, go out there and answer this month's security challenge just to get entered into the TechEd giveaway. References, we have some references from some other companies that we've done business with. If you want to go out and read their success stories, they're there as well. Alessandro is our CEO and has worked with another gentleman, and they have written a new SAP security book for SAP Press. And here's the information on that if you want to go peruse it, but it talks about the S/4HANA security, the SAP Business Suite, and Fiori. So those are HANA and Fiori are two topics that are new and becoming very challenging for most security folks at this point. And again, as Michael said, if you want more information, here's his contact information. Feel free to beat up his email and ask all the questions you want. All right, Michael, with that, we can open up questions if anybody has them.
Yep. Alessandro, you want to read some of those out loud and the answer?
Yeah, there was one question regarding the different role designs, and I have so many here, I just have to find it. Jeff, there was one question, if you can explain, what are our recommendations about task-based roles versus job-based roles?
Task-based roles are okay. I don't necessarily have a problem with task-based roles. Again, the problem becomes the maintenance and the assignments later on. The beauty of a single job role or maybe 2 or 3 job roles that make up a job is the ease of maintenance and the ease of user assignment, right? So one of the things you have to think about when you're building these types of roles or these types or your security is how easy is it going to be to assign the roles later. So when someone joins the company or somebody moves positions, how easy is it for you to give that access to a user? Task-based roles tend to be a little harder to do that. I've also noticed that your task-based roles tend to roll up into composite roles. That's usually where the task-based role concept ends up, is in a composite role design. And again, that becomes very convoluted as well, right? Because if this task role that you have ends up in 3 or 4 composite roles and one person needs access to something new, you now have to evaluate the impact to 3 different other roles as well. So task-based roles are okay. I would personally not go that route myself, but I know lots of people that do. And as long as you can control the maintenance of it and the ability to assign it, you shouldn't have a problem. I would still suggest job-based single roles, personally.
Perfect, thank you, Jeff. Then we had some other questions that we already answered. One was regarding if it's more difficult to select single rows in GRC. So when we're using, for example, SAP Access Control GRC for provisioning, if it's more difficult to select single rows over composites. And I said already, with SAP GRC, we have a lot of different capabilities. We can certainly use the business roles in GRC, so you can group them together depending on how your role design looks. When you build job-based single roles, where you have pretty much one role representing a job function or a task function, then it should be fairly easy to select the roles in GRC. If you build a lot of small single roles and you group them together through composites, so that you have a job function or a task function as a composite, and then you want to select those in GRC individually, that makes it a little more difficult, but usually for that purpose, we use the business roles in GRC. And Jeff, I don't know if you want to add something to that, but
yeah, your naming standard will have a lot to do with that ease as well. So one of the things we didn't talk about is the naming standard. So when you're trying to search for roles, or your user administrators are trying to search for roles, your naming standard will play an awful big part in the ease of that. Because typically they don't know what the role contains. They're looking for, I need somebody to do function X, and all they have to go by is the naming standard. All right, so your naming standard has a lot to do with the ease of assignment later on.
And also maybe, if you use, role mining and, role replicator with IDM and stuff, that could probably help as well, which you could go into more during our next webinar since we're running out of time.
Yep.
Yeah, there were a few other questions regarding role testing. If we do role changes, especially when we build single rows, job-based single rows, where we have a larger single rows, a lot of transactions, how we do role tests. Then I think that's a very good question that we will definitely address in the next webinar, where we will show tools, especially around productive test simulation. That's one of our functionalities that we have in the Exciting Authorizations Management Suite, where we can take away that the effort for testing, where we can shadow users in a productive environment and see how well new roles would cover a user or a group of users. So we can take away the need to go into a quality system and run test cases, as Jeff mentioned already. And that will definitely be part of the next webinar, where we will show tools that you can use and will help you to save time and effort for role testing. Okay, Michael, do we have more questions?
There are two new ones that just came in the questions box. Not sure if you've seen them yet.
So that was one question. Did you say that the new licensing considers the number of roles?
It does not consider the number of roles. It considers what the roles are authorized to do. So think of it this way. In the past, when you did your SLaw review, they would come in and they would look at the log, maybe ST03N, and they would find out what a user was doing, what transactions were they executing. And that's kind of what they based their audit review on your license as. Now what they're going to do is they're going to come in and they're going to look at essentially the user buffer. What is that user authorized to do? They don't care what you've been doing in the past. They want to know what you're authorized to do right now. So when they look, if you have basis access, for instance, and you're an accountant, I don't know why you would have those combinations, but if that was the case, you wouldn't be classified as a general user. You'd be classified as a professional user, professional basis user, because you're authorized to do basis work. Whether you do it or not is irrelevant. They're going to start looking at what you're authorized to do. It doesn't care about the number of roles. It cares about what you're authorized to do. So more along the lines of the user buffer. What are you allowed to do authorization-wise?
Then we had another question regarding if the SAP standard roles are a good starting point for a new role design.
I always liked them. I've built several companies' security prior to working for Exciting, using those as a good base of operations. So copying them over to my own namespace and using them as a starting point. When we talk at the next webinar, we provide with our virtual role designing tool, we provide templates for roles as well, based on our experience, which I think, in my opinion, after looking at them, are they're a little better than the SAP roles, in my opinion. But that's just because we have the experience and we know kind of what people have been doing with them. So yes, they're a good start. If you don't have another way to get that data, they're a good starting point. If you use our tool, we provide, I think, a little bit better templates for you, functional templates for you to use.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Then there was another question regarding the upgrade to S/4HANA regarding supported single roles versus composites. Anything?
Single roles are just easier to do the migration. So what you're going to end up doing if you don't use a tool, our tool, or somebody else's tool to help you with the migration, you end up having to go through the transactions that are in these roles, and you end up having to do the swap based on what they call the SAP simplification list. And they basically are swapping out certain T codes for other T codes, or certain T codes are going away altogether. The reason that a single role is easier to do that is that the transparency, right? I'm seeing everything that is in that role right now that is required for that job. And if I'm focusing on just that one role, I know it's not used anywhere else. With a composite role, now I not only have to look at what T codes are coming in and what T codes are going out, I have to now know if the new T code is something that is appropriate for all of the composite that this single role is in. So again, it's your maintenance that is always the problem with the composite roles, because you run the risk of impacting far more than just the one user or the one case that you're trying to adjust for. Mm-hmm. And the same will go forward with S/4HANA, right? You're gonna have the same problems with S/4HANA.
Correct. That was one of other question regarding the new authorization or the new license policy where they can get more information. So not all clients or all contracts were changed yet. So new customers will be on the new license model from, because they're getting a new contract. Existing customers with existing contracts are being, forced to agree on that new license classification type through when you renew your contracts. So SAP send out a few information. We will send out a follow-up email where you can find more information about that. But definitely the best point of contact will be your account manager from SAP. When there's a renewal of your contract, to talk to him or her, and they should be able to give you more information about what's the impact, what the impact will be. And then Jeff, maybe one last question that was that just came in. Please explain TSTCA check briefly. I think not everyone understood that.
Okay, so a TSTCA check is a check that happens at the transaction level. It's done by the kernel. So when you execute a transaction, the first thing that happens is that the SAP kernel goes out to see if the transaction exists, right? The second thing that happens, it goes out to see if the transaction is locked. The third thing that happens is that it goes out to see if on SE93, is there a transaction, a TSTCA authorization check flagged for that transaction? All of these checks happen before the program behind your T code, whatever the T code is calling, is even executed. Before you're presented with anything on the screen, those three things happen automatically. So a TC or a TSTCA check is a check that happens at transaction start. It's another authority check statement that happens at transaction start. If you go out to SE93, you'll actually see in SE93, there'll be a place about halfway down the initial screen for whatever transaction you're looking at. There'll be a authorization object field there. That's your TSTCA check. If you go into SU24 and you look at a transaction, there'll be a column that says TSTCA. And if there's a TSTCA check flagged for that transaction, it'll show up in that column.
Perfect. That was just a follow-up question. If it's different from the authority check, actually not. It's an authority check that's just performed by the kernel, and the only difference is it's not happening in the code itself, because it's happening before code gets called, from a program, for example. So it's similar to the ST code check that the system always performs. Is also that TSTCA object is being checked at transaction start. I hope that makes sense and makes it more clear.
If not, if you have more questions around that, send Michael an email, and I can either jump on a call with whoever had that question, or we can set up another phone or something. I can figure out how to get you some more information.
Okay, and I think with that, we're gonna wrap it up. I see there are a bunch of more questions in the questions box, but what we'll do is we'll go through them, we'll answer all of them individually, and then we'll send out an email to whoever asked the question. Assuming you provide an email address that's good, you'll get an email from us with the answer to your question. You'll also get the recording within 24 hours. I got a couple of emails during the webinar asking for a recording. So within 24 hours, you should be getting an automated email from GoToWebinar. I'll make sure that email goes out. If it doesn't, I'll send out a separate email with a link to YouTube once we've uploaded the recording. All right, and with that said, thank you very much. Thanks, Jeff, for delivering the webinar today. Thanks, everybody, for joining, for taking the time and spending an hour with us. We much appreciate it. And don't forget to sign up for our next webinar so you can see more of how you can execute some of the strategies that Jeff mentioned today using tools that simplify and automate role redesign projects. All right, thank you very much. Bye-bye.